Welcome to the Tide Pod. We had a massive conversation at the beginning of the week. Here's just a part of it for your listening pleasure. Enjoy.
As always, we're going to have the most tired take that anyone can have because that's who we are. But I want to kick things off today by sort of looking at, what 2024 means and just in general, what competitiveness means, right? We have talked previously about fast cars and really, is anyone going to beat the RB20 this year, right? But while we look at the car, we look at the drivers, and certainly there's lots to reflect on there. I think it's probably worth talking about what team structure means, and is any one of Red Bull's three, four rivals, if you want to call them,
Yeah.
those within sort of striking distance, if you will, of being able to give them a run at it this year. Are they set up right from a structure standpoint, from a lead designer standpoint, a lead architect of the car standpoint, to be able to really give them a challenge? And I think it's sort of worth looking at what Adrian Newey has done there. I think a couple months ago, I read about how he almost went to Ferrari at some point last year, and that never happened. My misery continues, but he's
Ah.
still there, and well, I have to admit, maybe that wouldn't have helped either, but
Yeah. That's not a bad point actually, Omar. So, uh, like, what would that have meant to you if Newey had gone to Ferrari, and what do you think the outcome
so
would have been?
So I think as a Ferrari fan, right, I'm always looking for wins. And I think we win when it comes to transaction days, right? Anytime there's a transaction, we have won that. If there was a world championship based on, or a constructors championship based on winning the off season, we would be number one, hands down. Ain't no Red Bull getting anywhere close to us. Okay, it is not happening. But yeah, I don't know. I think, I mean, we've talked previously about how Ferrari's structured when we talked about the Freddie Vasseur news and Mattia's news there. But I think it's fascinating to see what Red Bull have done from a structural standpoint with Adrian Newey at the helm and the way they've designed that team, right? That really allows them to maximize not just the car and the way it's performed, but it seems like they're able to eke out something new. And I'd be shocked personally if they wouldn't take a step forward with their car, right? Even
Yeah.
with the less wind tunnel time, I think they're so well set up to handle what comes their way, that I think that's interesting to talk about. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think the first thing to talk about is Adrian Newey. So why is he so special? Why is it that if you look back at the 90s, that entire decade was just a 10-year period of Newey cars dominating the track from 92 onwards. But why is he so good, and why is he so relevant right now? Why is it that the guy that has been in Formula One for 40 odd years is now it's still producing a dominant championship winning car year on year on year. And I think it comes back to the fact that Newey's unique in Formula One now. Like he's the last of a almost extinct breed of um, technical directors or chief designers. Chief designer, I think, is probably the most accurate way to describe him, because what Newey brings is not necessarily a dictatorial, this is how I need you to do things. It's the fact that he brings experience from such a wide variety of specialisms within Formula One, something that a jack of all trades, but actually an expert in all of those trades that nobody else has got in F1 at the moment. And what I mean by that is if you listen to what he says, so he did an episode of F1 Beyond the Grid not long ago, and this is also in his book, that he describes that the Formula One cars design is divided into three main things, right? You've got the aero, you've got the mechanical platform, and then you've got dynamics, and he talks about race engineering within that. And he's had a hand, he's been an expert in all of those things. Like he's worked in departments and walked across the Chinese glass walls between each of those departments and has been able to have an impact. A good example is over this season, or the 2022 season, he made a point of saying that we're coming into a ground effects era, and he personally went off and designed the front and rear suspension on the RB18 because he recognized from when he was, a junior partner at Fittipaldi back in the 70s that actually having a strong aero package in a ground effect era is one thing, but being able to control that is something completely different. And he knew that having a good mechanical setup was the key to unlocking the potential of these cars, and that's what he went off and designed. But you couldn't see somebody like James Allison, who number one hasn't lived through a ground effects era, hasn't worked in that ground effects era, and second is purely an aerodynamicist, really. That's where his specialism lies. How can you expect somebody like that to be able to immediately recognize that that's where the money is? That's how you're going to get potential out of this car. And it's really tricky both for Red Bull going forwards for when Adrian Newey finally retires, but also for how other teams compete with Red Bull right now, because Red Bull have completely revolved their structure around him and how to get the absolute most out of Adrian Newey. And that's probably something we can talk about, especially with regards to how he was courted by Ferrari during his early Red Bull days, because it's one thing having somebody like Adrian Newey, it's something else being able to actually harness that and make it effective. But how do other teams get the same breadth and cohesiveness of knowledge and bring that to bear on the design of their car when they don't have a person like Adrian Newey that is able to, in one person, combine all of the things that you need to be able to create a successful Formula One car? Because the other thing about this is that right now, that's not how Formula One teams are recruiting. And it's not how people are coming into Formula One teams. It's not that somebody comes in having years and years of experience across the board. They come in having done an aero degree or a mechanical engineering degree, or they've come through the race engineering department. That's how Ayu Komatsu has come up through Haas, right? And how do you then make a situation or create a situation at your own team where, even though you've got different individuals that are specialists in each of these things, how do you bring that together to make sure that the car ultimately is able to bring all those things together without having one mind that is able to do that combination and compute it all for you?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, right? I think the one thing that sticks out to me in everything you've said is this all goes back to team structure and strategy and vision, right? So Red Bull have had this almost, and it's slightly unfair to say it this way because it doesn't necessarily imply that other teams are not singularly focused on winning. I mean, after all, that's all the sport is about, really, at least for the top four teams, right? But it's in the way that Red Bull have gone about this, right? They have really created that environment for Newey to go ahead and really maximize his skills. So that's one element of it. And I think in many ways, 2021, given how competitive that season was, you kind of didn't see Red Bull coming into 22 with that kind of car. I mean, you could have almost given them a bit of a pass, if you will, to say, hey, look, you were competing until the very end. But in reality, like you said, Newey going away, him having that wealth of experience had already given them an advantage and a jump start on 2022. I mean, I think someday it'd be fascinating to know where the 2022, the RB18 car, right, was conceptualized. When was that actual time? Like, I have to imagine that in Newey's mind, it had probably already been ready the second those regulations had come out. Which leads me to the second point, which I think is, Newey is one of one, right? He's a bit of a unicorn, right? And that I don't know that you have anyone else on the grid now that has that kind of experience. I mean, as you said, He's part of an almost extinct breed of folks that put their hands in everything. With the way businesses operate, and particularly Formula One teams operate now, right? They operate in a more business siloed like structure where cross training is probably not being done in the same way that it used to be. Part of it is the access to information across the board, right? The technology allows you to dive into different areas without having that depth and knowledge. So I imagine that. I mean, one of my thoughts really with this is just, one of those odd timing kind of things, right? Where you're at the right place at the right time with the right person. Then I feel like on some level, Red Bull have struck gold in that they have someone in him that could, see more than one aspects of the car and the competition across the board and be able to kind of put it all together. I don't know, again, thinking about the Ferrari thing, right? We're joking about it, right? I don't know that he would have been that successful too, right? Because it is a partnership after all, right? And Ferrari doesn't think I don't think there's anything common between them and Red Bull in terms of the way they go about running that business, right? So, well, look, that's their formula for success has been different too, right? So, I think so. I think that is a fascinating thing, and it also sort of
I,
brings up, yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I mean, I think the Ferrari thing is really interesting because um, they're not the only ones that are guilty of this. But I agree with you that I think Adrian Newey turning up at Ferrari and having to fit into a structure that's already there, where sometimes you feel like Ferrari would have signed him as a marquee signing as opposed to because they actually knew how to get the best out of him.
Right.
And he would then be stuck in an office in Maranello trying to get these disparate departments to work together. And he does talk in his book about
Mhm.
um, early on in his F1 career, I don't remember which team he was at, but he talked about having the equivalent of a writer's block because he was just in a environment where he was having to work on so many different things, but have people and concentrate on just making the structure work that it used up all his creativity. He didn't have the space to come up with more ideas for the
Right.
car.
Right.
Um, and that sounds like a crime. Like how can you have somebody like Adrian Newey with all of the creativity that he brings and all of the ideas and the cohesion that he has in his thinking, and then not use that, squander it by having a poor team structure. And he already went through that when he was at McLaren, right? That he, in the early noughties, um, there was a conversation with Ron Dennis, and maybe Ron Dennis was future planning at this point.
Mhm.
But he was talking about Adrian Newey potentially having shares in McLaren, and as a succession planning that he would partly own the team alongside sort of Martin Whitmarsh and himself. But when it came down to it, Ron wasn't willing to give him the freedom that he wanted, and ultimately change the structure of the team. This was something that I think Martin Whitmarsh brought in, where they called it the matrix system, right? Where there was the way the whole team was set up, there was no one person that was making all the decisions. So it was all kind of done by committee. Newey calls them the mullahs of McLaren. And he got stifled. He got stifled, and the key example he brings up is that in 2003 they had a car that at the beginning of the season he'd made a mistake on. He recognized that mistake, had asked for a change of chassis, and because everything was now done by committee, he was voted down, and they didn't get that change of chassis, and he ended up having to bring that car, the concepts from that car, 2 years down the line, which resulted in
Mhm.
the 2005 car, which was probably the class of the field that year. Um, and I worry that if he went to Ferrari, that's what would happen. I think he thought the same thing as well. That part of the reason that he turned down Ferrari was because he was worried that one, he'd be stuck in a system that he didn't like, And second, that he'd be doing the same thing he'd done at Williams and the same thing that he did at McLaren, which was he'd fall into a system that was already there. He's not building something new. And Red Bull gave him a chance to build something from scratch. And they gave him the freedom to kind of say, okay, Adrian, how do you want to run this? And then he designed everything from there. And as soon as they had a regulation change in 2009, that had an impact like that. It proved that what they were doing, what Red Bull had done in signing him, was absolutely the right thing to do, and they've kept that structure and evolved it to allow him to form the department in his own image, but also allowed him to step back a little bit. Now, he still has input, as I said, with the suspension of the 2022 car. He still has input, but he's able to take a bit more of a back seat and just be the guy that's sort of whispering ideas in, as opposed to the guy that's leading everything from the front. And I think that's exactly what he wants. And I can't see him wanting to move away from that. I think that the other Formula One teams are going to have to come up with a creative way of replicating that, of having that one mind shared between a number of people and being able to still be cohesive. That is the challenge. And I don't know what you think about the way that Red Bull's rivals have come up with to do that.
I think that what this is where McLaren's interesting, right? Because it seems like they're building the sort of committee to get at him, right? It's at least on paper, right? It seems like they're bringing in 2 or 3 guys that will have the knowledge that Adrian Newey has and kind of put it together. At the end of the day, this is such an interpersonal business, right? If you have the right personalities in the right setup, in the right environment at the right time, and you allow them to, cook, right? And they can all get together, they can get along, then that'll work, right? So I think you're right. I think it's fair to cast questions over what the future of Red Bull might look like once he does eventually depart, which doesn't feel like anytime soon, but it might be sooner, right? And I think I think this is where the Ferrari example is also very interesting, right? Because Ferrari have a history and a legacy that's built on a lot of what Red Bull is only now accomplishing, right? So there's something to be said about an upstart team that is hungry and fully focused on dominating the sport, and not just winning, but winning in a way that really sets a message, right? And being there consistently, right? So they probably more so than maybe at any other time in their history, right, in their young history, felt like this is what they would value. But who's to say that 10 years from now, 15 years from now, when Red Bull have, dominated, looks like at least they're going to dominate, most of this decade, right? It's fair to assume in some way, shape, or form that where would that look like? Would they have the same patience and the same desire, right? Because, it's easy to look at Adrian's success now and look at it in that sort of positive light. But what if he had gotten it wrong, right? And I think that's kind of what you've seen at Ferrari too, right? Mattia did kind of get it wrong with the car, right? And yeah, maybe we can, look at what they're going to do in 24 now with, Project 676, right? We'll see what that looks like. But I think the reality also is that it takes leadership at the top, right? You almost have to give as much credit to all the people that are up above to say, okay, it does take time. And we've seen this in other sports, right? Where, I follow a lot of NFL and basketball, right? And there are losing seasons where you can imagine, the owner going, okay, this is it. We're done. We're going to move in a different direction. And then, that takes on a new cycle of its own. On the flip side, that the tipping point between failure and success is just that much more patience in some ways. And it did work out in this case. And of course, the regulations helped, right? Like we went into a ground effect era, right? Had that not been the case, who knows, right? I'm not suggesting that Newey wouldn't have been competitive, but this is what I mean by, ground effect is something Newey knows from his days. I mean, he's written about the fact that is something he paid a lot of attention to at one point in his career. And I don't know anyone else that knows ground effect nearly as much as he does, right? Just as a concept.
I think 2 points there, right? The first is that like Newey rarely misses. Like even even when the rules changed in 2014 to bring in the turbo hybrids, the main reason Red Bull didn't compete in those seasons was because they didn't have an
They
engine,
didn't have the engine. Correct. Yes.
right? So
Yes.
that you can't necessarily put that on Adrian Newey. And as soon as we had the ground effect era and they had an engine that was capable, actually, even in 2021, they had an engine that was on par. Yes, there was an aerodynamic penalty that was paid by Mercedes, but actually Red Bull with the team with the aero concept to be able to take advantage of that. They were right there. Nobody else was close to Mercedes, really. And historically, he's been the one that's been able to nail the regulation changes. You look back at the active suspension era at the beginning of the 90s, he was the one that was able to harness that properly with an aero package and engine mapping and exhaust blow and diffusers. They came in 1992. That was there on the FW14B. And then the narrow base cars in 98 nailed it. 2009 nailed it. 2022 nailed it. Every single time there's a big regulation change, it's because of the way he looks at it, right? And he talks about this all the time, that he's not looking at, okay, what is the intention of the rule change?
Mhm.
He looks at the rule book and goes, okay, where are the loopholes? What is it?
Mhm.
What is the exact wording of this regulation? How can I use that to my advantage? But I think what you said about about leading from the top, that's really fundamental. Like, none of this works if you have a corporate layer that is meddling in all of this. And that is always my worry with Ferrari. It's been my worry about Alpine since they've had all of the changes that they've had there. There's no point having a genius in your technical department if the men and women in corporate are constantly trying to interfere and make decisions and don't understand the timeline that you so eloquently described there. If you don't give that structure the time to do their thing, or you don't, I don't like the way that rear wing looks because it's not the same as that other team down the pit lane. Like, that's not your department. Get out of there. Just let the people do their thing. That I still think that was at least partly what killed Mattia Binotto's tenure at Ferrari. That there was just too much. There's too much interference from the top. They wouldn't let him do his job. And I think Adrian Newey in that scenario, in that environment of Ferrari, the same thing would have happened to him. So that's just a fundamental. I think Ferrari definitely need to have got on top of that before they're going to be able to mount serious challenges. So I think of the remaining teams that have a structure that allow them to let their technical departments do their thing independently, McLaren and Mercedes are probably best placed because Zach Brown at McLaren clearly realizes that I'm happy to put the people there that I think are going to do this job,
Right.
but it's not my job,
It's
right?
not my
I
job. Yeah.
I don't do that. So
Yeah.
there's no point in me saying you're moving down the wrong track, you're doing the wrong thing. And he's made some really smart hires. I thought Andres Seidel was brilliant. And he went as far as saying that, okay, look, I'm running the team, but Andres, you're running the actual race team. So hiring and firing is actually down to you. So Andres Seidel was who got James Key in, which I mean, I've got thoughts about that, but that's different. That's different. And when Seidel left and they brought in Andrea Stella for me is a very, very impressive individual, right? Really impressive. He's come through, again, a race engineering background. He race engineered Fernando for years and years at Ferrari, followed him over in 2015 to McLaren, and is now team principal of McLaren. I mean, that's mental, isn't it? But he strikes me as a guy that has always had a couple loaded in the chamber, right? He's always had an idea of in this era of Formula One, with everything that he's seen and all the success he's seen at Ferrari, because he was there in the early years as well, right? He has a clear idea of what he thinks is the best way to challenge, and now he's done that. McLaren also very transparent in the way that they've structured things. They've been quite clear about like this is how we're structured our technical department. And Stella has had the free reign to do that, right? And he's done exactly what you talked about. He's tried to get people from the absolute specialists in the area to be heads of departments. He's got an aero department. He's got a engineering and design department, and he's got a concept and forward planning department. And he's put three exceptional people. He's got Peter Prodromou as head of aero, who was at McLaren with Newey before. He was at Red Bull with Newey in the success years, and then moved back to McLaren again. So, like, I think he's beyond the pale. He just hasn't had a structure to be able to really unleash his talents. And then you've got Rob Marshall, who's just come along from Red Bull. You can't have the experience and the knowledge that brings. And then he's brought David Sanchez along from Ferrari as well. So those are your three technical heads. And they're the ones that are going to take all of the information that's come from lower down, all the data that's been crunched and analyzed, and they then form that into a plan for what they think is good for the car, and then they talk to each other and they bring all of that together. If you're going to have a hive mind, that sounds like a very sound way of doing it. Creating the Adrian Newey mind between three people effectively.
And yet I think it's a very flimsy arrangement, right? What if Zach Brown leaves a year from now? What if Andrea Stella moves on to somewhere else, right? Like so yes, I do agree with you. I think that this is really at the cutting edge of success, right? As much as the on-track stuff is, right, at the cutting edge of success, right? This is literally where it happens, right? And I think that's why we, in part, I think it's fair to assume that McLaren has the best chance of giving Red Bull a run for their money, at least earlier on in the season, right? Because they are really going to be able to build upon what they already did the half of last year, the second half of last year, right? And then the added knowledge that Rob Marshall would bring in, and also with David Sanchez, I think is really going to help them right from the get-go.
Yeah, and Ahmad, that's really impressive, right? Because for the longest time, McLaren have been sitting there going, "Look, we're going to come good once we have our wind tunnel on stream. We're going to come good when we have our new driver in loop simulator." It was always success deferred a year or two down the line, after this big thing happened, where Stella seems to have thrown that in the bin and said, "Look, it doesn't matter. We've got a structure. We need to be doing well now." And that's what happened.
Yeah. Well,
that's why I've always had some reservations about James Key and his ability to work in a big team, in a front running team. He's a good technical director, but I think that he doesn't have the vision that somebody like Stella does. And Stella's had the vision to bring all this together and has brought that structure to bear early on in his tenure, and it's had results quickly at McLaren in the second half of last season, which without the help of a brand spanking new wind tunnel, I think that's really impressive and ominous for other teams going forwards.
On top of everything that we just talked about McLaren, what is the other formula, the magic potion that will really help them get to success, which is that they have not had success in a long, long time, right?
Yeah,
2008.
They are hungry.
They're
Yeah,
hungry.
they're hungry.
They're hungry in a way. So that combination of hunger, structure, car, driver, you can see why they're best positioned to kind of do that, right? I mean, you can almost rule out Ferrari because of all the anomalies and the randomness that comes with it. Maybe they figure it out, maybe they don't. Mercedes, we don't know because the car seems like, it's going to be a brand new car. So again, it does seem like a bit of a random factor, but McLaren has a lot of these things lined up and no other obvious sort of competitor, in their chase of Red Bull, right? They're Aston Martin, maybe, who knows? But really, they have all the pieces together for a good 24.
I think Aston and Mercedes are both. I agree. They're the big unknowns. We know about Aston quickly. Like Aston have got a technical director that clearly knows what he's doing, is held in high regard at the team that he just came from. Red Bull didn't want him to go. He was the right-hand man to Adrian Newey at Red Bull during his time there. But again, this comes down to structure. He had a big impact immediately, but the fact that they fell off so precipitously towards the end of the season. Now, how much of that is because Dan Fallows himself didn't have the ideas or the creativity to make that a sustained success, and how much of it is actually because the structure at Aston Martin is still not quite ready to harness what he can bring, right? Because I think that for me is what happened at Mercedes. That in 2022, when the new car was designed, I know that James Allison had something to do with it at the start, but actually the bulk of the heavy lifting was done by Mike Elliott and his team in 2022 and in 2021 and into 2022. And the way that it's described, again, this is coming from a very candid interview that Allison did. And if anyone wants to find it, if you look for his interview on the Performance People podcast, he talks about the fact that when he came back, when he was asked to come back and take a more active role, what he found was that all of the different departments, they have all this data, all this information in front of them. And the job of a Formula One team, the structure of all of this is to be able to use that data and interpret it correctly, and to then come up with the right ideas, solutions based on that information. And in 2022, what James Allison found when he came back and saw what was going on was that all of the different departments were really desperate to get back to the front, and they were taking all this information, they were coming up with ideas, but it was all in a silo, and there was no regular review of what that information meant and sharing with the other departments to try and bring that together and to stop each department from going down a rabbit hole that actually it may in that individual specialism have been impressive. But actually, when you brought everything together, you'd find that actually those two things didn't, it was a dead end. The zero pod idea seems like a case in point of that. That the aero department went down this rabbit hole and said, we've got all of this massive downforce that we can generate, but the mechanical department weren't involved in that conversation, and therefore, when that concept was put on them, they have to sit back and say, well, okay, you need this to work at a really low ride height. We can't give you the suspension to do that, because maybe they could have done that, but they weren't necessarily involved early enough to be able to say, look, you need to compromise your aero development, your aero ideas, because the mechanical platform won't allow you to do that. That's what Adrian Newey was able to do at Red Bull, because he was able to take that. Yes, there is massive potential for aero here, but actually you need the mechanical platform to be able to harness that. And he said early on that this is the restriction, and actually the Red Bull maybe doesn't have the ultimate peak downforce that the other cars have the potential for, but it's able to harness effectively what it does have, because it has a mechanical platform that allows it to do that. Okay, fine, technicality, right? And it's a sort of technical nuance, but the fact that Mercedes weren't able to do that speaks to the fact that there was one department that were just super excited and just went down their own route and didn't talk to anybody else. And that, I think, is what James Allison says that he's started to bring now. And you could see it in 2023 as well with, I mean, the problem with the Mercedes often is that it's a lot of talk, and then you see potential results further down the line. So, but what they were saying sounded like it was a good idea, that they're bringing everyone together for regular reviews to talk about where everybody is. That, you can see where the potential is and see where you can continue to go down a rabbit hole, and where actually someone needs to be reined back to say, well, actually, yeah, that might work for you, but for us, it brings this disadvantage. So can you think about it in a different way? If they've done that effectively and they've created that hive mind that McLaren seem to have got right so far, then potentially Mercedes will be a force again. I think what this all speaks to, Amar, is that it's not about copying a car that a rival has. It's not about copying a rear wing or copying a diffuser. That's part of it. Yes, looking at other people's ideas and seeing how they fit with yours is fine. But that's not how you're going to win in F1. I think it starts much more fundamentally than that. And if you want to succeed in F1, actually, maybe you need to copy somebody else's team structure, and that's how you're going to win.
So you're telling me that the millions of dollars I spent trying to grab photos of Checo Perez's Red Bull from Monaco are no good? Like, is that what you're trying to say? Like, this is our take, Shez. This is our take. It don't matter what the car is, right? Go take a picture of their team standing together and then copy that structure, right? That's what we want to do.
But also go on their LinkedIn page
Go on their LinkedIn page.
to find out exactly what everybody's job description is.
So they're not doing this right. So if you're a Formula One team listening to us, just go look at the organizational structure, the hierarchy of your team. Actually, go over to Red Bulls, find a way to hack into their system. I didn't say that. Find a way to get to know what they're doing and do that. But no, I do agree with you. I think it's so funny, right? When teams are successful, right? We give the credit to a driver or a team principal, or in this case, Adrian Newey. But it really is the sum total of all its parts, right? Like, and it's putting the right pieces together, creating the right environment, creating the right structure, the right lines of communication, revisiting them over and over again. And I also think, again, a lot of this is a factor of what happens when you get success, which is what intrigues me about Red Bull coming into this year, right? Because they have had a year unlike any other. And if we know one thing about human tendency, complacency is almost certain to follow. And that is the intriguing factor for me coming into this season, is where, if at all, do we see Red Bull kind of show some cracks in how they're doing things, right? Whether it's in the development of the car, we all expect it to move forward, but who knows where that could go, right? We expect them to perform well on race day, which they have, but last year they didn't really get challenged in any way. So we don't know a lot about what we don't know a lot about, right? And so, yeah, I think, and one more thing, reliability, right? I mean, you talked about how unreliable their engines were, right? A few years ago, but they've had reliability unlike any other over the course of the last 2 years. I mean, even if we go back to those first couple of races in Melbourne, that really was an engine failure. I mean, there was one race where they couldn't really figure out a very sort of, simple thing, right? It really wasn't an engine blowing out like Ferraris did in
but they
in Austria.
they have double retirements, right?
Yeah,
yes,
fair enough.
But I think Red Bull, and this goes back to an earlier conversation, right? Red Bull in their down years, when they weren't winning everything, were honing all of the things that they had control over.
Sure.
So they couldn't necessarily control the how far Mercedes were getting in terms of those regulations, in terms of air, and how they could harness their power unit, but they were able to have the quickest pit stops. They were able to absolutely nail strategy because they had to, because when the slightest opportunity presented itself, they had to be able to take it. And they've kept that going. So even when they're dominant, they don't let those things slip. So other than McLaren, they have the fastest pit stops. And their strategy means that even if Max starts 23rd, that's not even on the grid. That's in another postcode. He's still got a chance of at least finishing on the podium, if not winning the race. There's no situation in which to the point where he could win in Abu Dhabi with a less than ideal strategy, but do it in a way that allowed him to have the most number of laps led in a season. I mean, it's crazy. That's the level of strategy that they have, and they've built that up over their fallow seasons. It's but I was going to say something else and I've forgotten. But that's what where the foundation of their success, I think, is built.
I agree. I don't I would just love to see all of this be tested, right? And it be tested in a way like it's not been before. So I am secretly hoping that McLaren will be able to give them a, some run for their money in some ways. And magically Ferrari will figure out something somewhere, maybe an extra 20 kph in that engine that I'm looking to see happen now. Since 2 years I've been listening about it, like get that engine made already. And I know they can't really do that anymore, but who knows? But I think again, once you push them right in ways that they have not been pushed before, I think it'd be fantastic to see, because ultimately this is a people business, right? And it's success is always hard to maintain. But I have no doubt that they will do it this year. I have no doubt, and we can't walk into the season
Yeah,
thinking that there would be any
yeah,
other result outside of that.
yeah. I mean, I absolutely agree that they're the favorites, but there are unknowns out there, right? But we don't know how successful the other teams have been
Yeah, yeah,
in creating their new
right,
concepts.
right.
McLaren, I think, are probably the best known out of that because we saw what they did at the end of last season.
Yeah.
Aston and Mercedes, frankly, I don't know. Mercedes enjoy talking a big game. Their game talking is big, and it's
I like what you did there.
um, but whether that translates into actual lap time, I guess I don't know. Time will tell. But listen,
It's
I'm like you. Like I do want to see competition at the front. One thing that I guess stands in our favor is that this will be the third season of these regulations, and Zach Brown I think was worried that Red Bull have had such a head start on the 2024 regulations because on their 2024 car because they've not really had to develop their 2023 car. They've been so far ahead, they've not needed to do anything. So they've got loads of tokens to spend on the 24 car. But the contra argument to that is what James Allison says, is that is there potentially a glass ceiling to that concept? And is there actually potentially a lower ceiling to these ground effect cars than there was in the previous generation of cars? So will Red Bull run into the law of diminishing returns earlier than they would have in previous rule cycles? If that's the case, then game on. We'll have closer racing straight away.
And that might be the only hope too, right? I mean, Red Bull are also good at handling the PR stuff of this, right? So they might have already hit that ceiling. We just don't even know, and they would never tell us that too. So yeah, I love concluding a talk on a more optimistic note, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what we want. We want a little more competition, right? So there we go.
Yeah.
But hey, crown him right now. Like Newey should be walking around the grid with a crown, in my opinion. Like that, there should be like a crown designed for someone like him. Be like, that's what he got. Just like Max has his golden helmet, right? That's kind of what he needs.
I mean, I'm all right. I think it already is. I think when he retires, 1992 to whenever he decides to hang up his drawing board, will be remembered as the era of Newey, right?
Oh,
it will be. He's just had such a massive impact on the way that Formula One works. Like the entire structure of the cars up until 2022 was based on his design, and he's doing it again now. You cannot understate that level of impact.
It's genius.
And the amazing thing about it is that there will never be another because the way that F1 is structured and the way that people are coming through doesn't allow for that, which is scary, isn't it?
Incomparably, this is sort of the final chapter on beings like him, right? And I think again, we'll probably have AI doing a lot of this stuff, and poorly, I might add, but that's probably where it's going.
Well, if they can download Adrian Newey into an AI,
there we go.
Yeah, there you go.
That's what Ferrari needs. That's what they need. They need.
So okay, if anyone's thought of it, Red Bull will have already.
Red Bull probably have, right? They secretly placing a chip in his head that sort of copies everything.
Yeah, exactly. This is the the DEFCON 3
Yeah.
status for Red Bull. If anything happens to Newey, of course,